It's actually terrifying having a full hall on the afternoon of the second day, but thank you all for coming. We will get straight into it. So I'm Ross. I sometimes go as Magic Roundabout, and that is a reference to an actual roundabout, if you know what Swindon is like. And so you'll find me there on Twitter if you want to get hold of me, and Ross Wintle's an uncommon name, so you can find me in most places just by searching for me. You're not here to hear about me. I hope, with the room change, that you are here to talk about code. Put your hand up if you're here to talk about code. Good. If you're not here to talk about code, then there are far more interesting things going on in the other rooms, so you have my permission to leave and go elsewhere. We're going to talk about code because, as you probably know, coding is actually really, really easy, and coding is really easy because computers are, in fact, incredibly stupid. And we know computers are stupid because they are binary machines. They only understand 0 and 1 at their very basic level. They can compare 0 and 1, and they can add and subtract 0 and 1. So because they're very simple machines, they must be very, very simple to tell them what to do and to get them to do the right things. So we're going to get straight on. We're going to start writing some code. Who did primary school mathematics? Okay, maybe you recognize this. Does anyone know what this does? Please shout out. Thank you. This does addition. I hope you're all aware of that. I'm going to do the most risky thing in the world. I'm going to try and do some live coding, because live coding is always a good idea. And nothing ever goes wrong when you try and do live coding at all. So I'm going to break out. And nothing ever goes wrong. Right, so this is my browser. You may not know, but in your browser you can conjure up a JavaScript console. Oh, you're not going to work, are you now? Okay. And this is the WordCamp website. We can clear stuff out of here, and we can make this bigger so you can all see it, like this. Ooh. This is hard with nervous fingers, you know, on a big screen. We get the console. If you want to find out how to run the console, there are probably people in this room who will come and ask me how to do that. Can you all see the little flashing cursor? What we do here is we type in JavaScript, like that. That's not JavaScript. We type in JavaScript, and when we type something on this line, we're asking JavaScript, what is whatever I've typed on the line? So if I type in 2, I'm asking the question, what is 2? And so I get back 2. Perfect. If I type in 7, what do I get back? 7. You're good. If I type in, say, 1 plus 2, then we're doing this addition thing that we all know about because we learned it in primary school. So what do I get back? Sorry, 5? 12? You're way ahead of me. Please don't get ahead of me. We get 3, as some of you have said. So this is great. But computers are cleverer than that, even. Computers know about decimal numbers. So if I type 0.1, I get 0.1. If I type 0.2, I get 0.2. And if I type 0.1 plus 0.2, we're doing simple addition, so what do I get? Is there a 0.3? Wrong. We can also do this clever thing in JavaScript. We can prompt for something. So I can say, give me a number. And what this does, it'll be a bit small on this screen, but this gives me a box that says, give me a number. And I can type a number in here, like 5, and that comes back. So I've asked, what is prompt, give me a number? And the answer is 5. And it's got these funny little things around it, but let's not worry about them. I can, you are way ahead of me. I can do this, and then I can say, well, what if we do this and then we add 1 to it? Who was I over there that said 12? What do I get? If I type 5 in here, 51. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's do a quick bit of PHP just to show that we can do stupid things in PHP as well. That's in this screen over here. Come on. Oh no. Timekeeper, this is an extra minute. So I can run this thing called PSY shell, like this, PSYSH. And then we could do crazy things like, this came up in the Slack the other day. Belinda, I think, will recognize this. If you do 10 plus 10 in this particular format in PHP, does anyone know what we get? 16. So, back to here. There's a technical term for this, and I borrowed this, I make no apologies for borrowing this from a guy called Gary Bernhardt. He does a geeky 5-minute talk that hopefully most of you will understand some of. There's the link to that, but he came up with this concept of what? And he has lots of funny pictures in his talk like this. What? What is going on? Who thought that this was a good idea? These computers are supposed to be simple. I can't really pull off what quite, so I go, oh, cripes, because I'm an English person. And it turns out this coding thing that we thought was easy, even just plain adding up, isn't as easy as we thought. And maybe you think, well, go and look at the documentation and find out what does plus do. And if you eventually find the arithmetic operators page of the Mozilla documentation for JavaScript, you'll find this. And if I chop out all the bits that you really, really need to know, this is the definition of what plus does. And if I take out all the words that you probably already know the meaning of, then you end up with this bunch of highlighted technical terms, which you may or may not know the meaning of, or that maybe look like you know the meaning of, but there's some specific technical meaning that you don't know. And people, well, I've observed that people come into coding these days from all sorts of backgrounds. Designers will learn some HTML and CSS and then some JavaScript, and then maybe move on to back-end Node or PHP. People who use page builders and things to build sites may end up making a child theme and then copying and pasting stuff into a functions file or something without really knowing what it does. And all of these paths are perfectly good paths into coding, and my path into coding was from a formal software development background. So I got a computer science degree, and so I learned the underlying principles first. And I want to make it clear that I'm not judging anyone here, that actually, if you take this path into coding, it's quite possible to go on and become a way better developer than I am, and all paths are valid, but I've got some of these underlying principles, and that's what I'm going to try and share with you by introducing some language and terminology and some concepts, and towards the end, some tools that I hope will make you code better, will be a better coder, be able to fix problems faster, learn things more quickly, understand the documentation that we've already seen is quite complicated, and most of all, I want you to go away from this talk not being scared, but being curious and inquisitive about what your code does and why it does it. Some notes. We will focus on PHP and JavaScript because they are primarily the languages that WordPress people will use. And I'll avoid talking about object-oriented programming because that complicates things greatly. And a note to, if you're a proper software, if you've got a formal software background or you're a more advanced developer, you may know some of this stuff. Can I appeal to you? I am simplifying things in order to cram a lot into 30 minutes. Please keep your hand down unless I ask you to put it up, in which case that's fine. Get some water. So, let's start with some terminology. We're going to start with expressions, and expressions in programming are bits of code that have value. And I don't mean you can't buy them at your local corner shop, or you can't sell them on the black market for huge amounts of money. They're not that kind of value. What I mean is that the computer, if given an expression, will evaluate it and tell you what the value of it is. So here are some very simple expressions. We've already seen that 2 is an expression that returns 2 when we type it in. Hello world is a piece of text, so that is an expression. And a variable, which in PHP starts with $, is an expression, or in JavaScript doesn't start with anything, just a name, that is an expression as well. There are more complicated expressions like arrays and objects and accessing items from arrays and objects. Won't go into too much detail, be aware that they exist. Some of these expressions are what are called literals. And with a literal, you get back exactly what you type in. So if I type in 2, we saw earlier, you get back 2. If I type in some text in quotes, I get back the text in quotes. If I type in an array with some literal values inside it, I get back the array, and so on. There are also variables. We've seen the $home or home, depending which language you're in, is a variable. Accessing an item from an array is a variable, and accessing a property of an object, depending on your language at the bottom. If you type these things in, you don't get back exactly what you got typed in. You get back the current value that is assigned to that variable. So you get back something other than what you type in. That's variables. Functions are also expressions. So if you see a name of a function with the brackets after it, that is calling a function, and that will give you back a value. You can, can we do this? You can pass values, and this is what's called a method. So this is a function inside an object that you can call. These are all expressions. And you can combine expressions together. So when we do simple arithmetic with 2 plus 2, the 2's are expressions themselves. The plus in the middle is what's called an operator. And the whole thing itself also has a value. Is anyone at this point up for guessing what 2 plus 2 is? 4. These aren't trick questions anymore, although some of them are. And you can combine other kinds of expressions together. So is archival, is search, you might see in a WordPress template file. And here we've got 2 function calls, which are expressions. We've got an operator in the middle, and the whole thing will also evaluate to a value of its own. And so that is an expression as well. And you can make really complicated expressions. This is kind of medium complicated, but when you start to break it down, it looks something like this. And you may be thinking, well, I write loads of expressions now that I know what they are. So, look, what other code do I write? What is there that's not an expression? And the other major building block you'll come across is what's called a statement. Statements do stuff, but they don't have value normally. Sometimes they do, but let's pretend that they don't. And some statements that you may have seen include things like if statements, or while loops, or for each loops. These kinds of statements control the flow of your program, the order in which things happen. So they control the flow, order, execution. Other statements define or declare things for future use. So in JavaScript, you might see a declaration of a variable like this with var, or these days you could see let or const instead. But this doesn't have any value. It just prepares something for future use, as does declaring a function over here. This doesn't have any value, but it makes a function available for future use. So you can define or declare things to exist. And some statements just do stuff. So if you echo something in PHP, like this, that doesn't have value, but it will just print something to the screen or to the output, depending on what you're doing. You can return values from functions, and if you're really fed up with your program or something's gone wrong, you can exit it, and exit clearly doesn't have value. So maybe you're bored and it's home time and you want to exit, and we can put all these things together into something that looks a bit like this. So we've got expressions, operators, statements, and this all forms one big statement of code, which is a block of code that will execute and do something. So expressions, operators, and statements, these are the building blocks of your code. Let's talk a bit about variables. Variables are named boxes that can hold on to values. So I couldn't find a decent picture of a box, like a symbol of a box, so I've just used a bag, so let's call them bags. And this is a PHP variable bag called name. And my name is Ross, so we put Ross into the bag. And this process of putting a variable inside, or a value inside a variable, is called assignment. And we do it with this equals. And so here I'm saying the variable $name is assigned the value Ross. And it's in quotes, important. Bizarrely, assignment you probably think is a statement that has no value, but actually assignment in both languages has value. And so you can do odd stuff like this that you probably wouldn't do, or you can do stuff like this which you might want to do, where we've actually got an expression here which is going to evaluate to true or false, but it's also doing the assignment at the same time. So you can make use of the fact that assignment does actually have value in some cases. So this is your first little coding quiz, and I will talk you through it. So let's see. This is PHP, We have a variable called a, and we've assigned it a list of numbers. This is called an array, which we'll find out about later. So a is 1, 2, and 3. And then we're assigning a to b, so we've now got a variable b, which has the same value as a. And then we're going to do array pop. And what this does is, climb up. It chops the 3 off the end, okay? Array pop chops the last item off the end of an array. So, it's all right, it's all right. So a is now 1, 2, because we've chopped the 3 off. What is b? 1, 2, 3, thank you. B is 1, 2, 3. If I write this same code or equivalent code in JavaScript, A is 1, 2. Does anyone know what B is? 1, 2. What? This is something that will trip you up. This is due to something called copy by reference and copy by value. In PHP, well, in both languages, numbers and text and strings and Booleans are handled fairly simply. But we'll talk about arrays because they're useful to talk about. In PHP, arrays are copied by value. So we have a bag called A, and we put 1, 2, 3 in it. And then when I say $B equals $A, I create a new bag, and that new bag also has 1, 2, 3 in it. Then when I array pop A, like this, I chop the 3 off of this one, but not off of this one. This is copy by value. In JavaScript, we do what's called copy by reference. You may also you'll hear references and pointers talked about. They are the same thing, really. In JavaScript, when we create A with 1, 2, 3, we create a bag with 1, 2, 3 in it, and the A points at the bag. If I then say, well, okay, B equals A, what happens is we create a B over here, and it points at the same bag. So if I then do my pop, I chop the 3 off the end, but because both of these are pointing to the same bag, both have the value 1 and 2. So numbers and text and strings and like true-false values, which we'll talk about later, they are all fairly simple. They are all copied by value. In JavaScript, both object and arrays are copied by reference. And in PHP, objects are assigned or copied by reference, and arrays are assigned by value. Watch out for this, it will trip you up. This is a slide I'm not going to talk through, but it's another example involving an object. Your homework is to find which side is Anakin after Vader turns dark. One more thing that will trip you up with variables and assignment. I wrote this code in PHP. So, just fade? Yes. So we set number to 1, and then we say if number equals 5, we're going to echo it's 5, which we wouldn't expect, I think. What happens next? It's 5. Why? Like, we set number to 1, so why is number equal to 5? We're using a single equal sign here, which is assignment. So what we're doing is this thing we saw earlier, where we're assigning and asking the question at the same time. Single equals. We can get around this by using the double equals, which actually does proper comparison, or you'll see later there's a triple equals, which does a stricter comparison. Another way to fix this, and this is controversial possibly, but some people do this. They put the thing that you can't change first, and the thing that you can change, the variable, second. And so if you do this, if you accidentally put the wrong thing in here, then you'll get a PHP parse error, and your code won't run at all. This is called Yoda notation. That was another Star Wars reference. Okay. Okay, good. So we've talked about variables, assignment, and references. These are ways that you store and move values around. Let's talk about types. Types are categories of things that have similar properties. So in the real world, you might see some letters, you might see some numbers, you might see some books, you might see some animals. So letters have similar properties. They have an order. You can put them together into words and so on. Numbers have an order, and you can do mathematics with them. Books have pages and indices, and you put them on a shelf and you read them. And animals, well, I'm scared of elephants, so they just kind of go around terrorizing the world, basically. But they tend to have legs and be alive and things like that. In programming, your types are things like numbers, which are, oh, my pointer's not working. You could be whole numbers, they could be positive numbers, they could be negative numbers, they could be decimal numbers. In JavaScript, all numbers are just called numbers. In PHP, you have integers, which are whole numbers, and floats or floating point numbers, which are the decimal numbers. I only recently learned that JavaScript does this, and it was quite a revelation. Strings, which have quotes around, are bits of text. Note that even this number at the bottom is a string, even though it has quotes around it. And then you have Booleans, which are, they can only be true or false values, and they tend to be if you ask an if question, or an expression that's asking a question that can be true or false, then you'll get a Boolean back. There's also objects, which is where you can make up your own types, and arrays, which are lists of things that we've always seen, already seen in brackets. And note that in JavaScript, arrays are just a kind of object. And in PHP, arrays are a different kind of thing that behaves very differently. And in both the languages that we're talking about, it's the values that have types, not the variables. What does that mean? Well, in some languages, when you create your variable, our dollar number here, you give that variable a type. And so your bag can only hold things of that type. You can do this in PHP, but let's pretend you can't. So if we've got hello world as a piece of text, I can't put hello world into an integer bag, and that is not allowed. In both PHP and JavaScript, the values are typed. So my bag just has a name, and I can put whatever I like into it. It's an infinitely expanding bag. And so I can put both my string and my integer into it, and JavaScript and PHP are fine with that. So we saw something like this earlier. We prompted in JavaScript for give me a number, and then we added 1 to it. And what happened next? If I typed in 5 to the prompt, what did I get? 51. So what happened was the prompt was giving me back a string, and it was trying to add it to a number. And it was giving me 51. And we were like, what? Or cripes. And this happens because of a thing called type conversion, also known as casting or coercion or sometimes type juggling. This is where you change one type into another type. So if we look at our 5 in quotes plus 1, JavaScript looks at this and says, well, one of these is a string and one of these is a number. And that's not helpful because if I'm using plus, I want to add together things that are the same type. So I'm going to change the number into a string, and then I'm going to add them together. And when I add strings together, I do what's called concatenation, and we end up with sticking them together, and we get 51. This is called implicit or automatic type conversion. It's quite complicated, and sometimes your computer will do what you think it's going to do, and sometimes it doesn't, and it's very confusing. Here is, thanks to Belinda for sending this through. I talked to Belinda a bit about this talk, and she was very helpful with a couple of things. This is the table of JavaScript type conversions that you can do. Take a picture. You won't be able to read it. It'll be in the slides later, and there's a link. Is there a link? Yes. Great. And so these are all the type conversions that can happen in JavaScript. And the other type of conversion you can do is manual type conversion. So if we do our 5 plus 1 here, we can actually say, okay, I know that this is a string, so I'm going to turn that into a number because I want to do things with numbers. So in JavaScript, I can put parseInt in front, and that will turn it into a number. And now I've got 2 numbers, and JavaScript will do addition, and we get back the 6 that we wanted. For manual type conversion, there's a number, I won't talk through these, but these are reference slides. So these are different ways of converting things into other things using JavaScript. These are ways of converting things into other things in PHP. There are also ways to check types by using typeof in JavaScript or getType in PHP, or you can ask PHP if things are of particular types. So you can do all those kinds of things. And we saw earlier this double equals and triple equals. Double equals does a comparison between A and B, but it says to the computer, you sort the types out, I can't be bothered, you do it for me, and bad stuff can happen. If you use triple equals, you're saying compare these two things and only tell me they are the same if they are the same value and the same type. So that's a useful thing to do. Some people advocate for using the triple equals everywhere. There's a lot of stuff here. Be aware that types exist and are a thing. Know that you can check them. Know that you can change between them. Know that your computer will sometimes change between them for you. And know that you can do conversions in, you can do comparisons in different ways. We saw some operators earlier. Let's talk about operators again. You saw some code like this earlier. This does not reveal my age. This is some JavaScript code. And we do I am plus 2019 minus 2000 plus years old. This was actually in, I think, a Code Academy exercise, like a proper online coding tutorial exercise. What happens next? Nan years old. What? Firstly, Nan is a JavaScript thing. It's short for not a number. And this happens because, have you seen these on Facebook? They're like a plague. They are everywhere. They're actually quite fun. I often get them wrong. But these puzzles all require you to know about a thing called BODMAS. Who knows BODMAS from school? Or BIDMAS, I think it's now called. BODMAS is a way to remember the order that you do different kinds of mathematical operation in, and it's short for brackets, order, division, multiplication, addition, and subtraction. In computer programming, this is called operator precedence and operator associativity. And this is the order in which the operators are evaluated. So if I look at the last line of one of these puzzles, so in this one, a yellow flower is 1, a red flower is 20, a blue flower with 4 petals is important, is worth 4, and we have to work out the answer. And the trick is we have to know that we did the multiplication first, otherwise we get it wrong. So we do the 20 times 4, which gives us 1 plus 80. 1 plus 80 is, they weren't in quotes, so it's 81. And this is operator precedence. There's a lot of operators, and so there is a big table that tells you what the order of operator precedence is, with the one at the top being the one that happens first, and the one at the bottom being the one that happens last. This will trip you up as well. This probably won't trip you up as often, but operator associativity is in the left-hand column of this table, and this tells you operators of the same precedence, are they evaluated from right to left or from left to right? Usually this works as you expect it to, but this little problem here that we saw actually is a problem of both operator associativity and of type conversion. So what we do first here is associativity says that plus and equals are of equal precedence. So we'll do them left to right because this is left associative. So we do I am plus 2019 first. So that's why I've put that in like pretend brackets. I am plus 2019 converts 2019 into a string and joins it together. So we get I am 2019. And the next thing we do is we subtract 2000 from that. Now JavaScript is quite happy to add strings and numbers together. It's not so happy about subtracting them. So this becomes, well, that's not a number. And JavaScript is then happy to add not a number to years old, and so we end up with 9 years old. Operator precedence and associativity, again, I can't tell you everything there is to know about them. Be aware that they exist and that they control the order that expressions are evaluated in. Let's look at functions quickly. Functions are blocks of code. They have names. They are reusable. They have inputs and outputs optionally. This is a function kind of thing you might see inside WordPress. It has a name. It has some parameters. It has some function code that the function runs. And we can optionally return something from it. This is the anatomy of a function. I'm going to skip through this, I think, because I'm quite short on time, but I just want to point out that when we call a function and pass it a variable, that ends up in the parameter to the function. And these work the same way that copy by value and copy by reference work. So if I'm in PHP and I pass an array, I get a second bag with a copy of the value in. If I'm in JavaScript, both these things, they won't have dollars, but they will point to the same bag. So if I modify the array inside the function, it will also modify the array outside the function. Returns from functions are also quite important. So if you're expecting to assign the result of this function call expression to a variable, then the function must return something. I really don't have time to talk about scope. Go and read about scope, it's important, it will trip you up. Basically, variables don't exist everywhere, they can only be seen in certain places. Just as a really simple example, here's a function in PHP. I've got a post down here and a reference to something called post up here, but the function is kind of fenced off, and so my post reference here can't see this post reference here. In JavaScript, it's a whole other world of like pain and complexity. Scope. Nice. You're probably now thinking, phew. Or maybe you're thinking, what? Or maybe you've fallen asleep. Is it okay? You all look good. Or maybe your mind has been blown and you're like, my whole world is going to have to change now. We learned a whole load of stuff, really, and we learned it all very quickly. And my point of today, having asked kind of, okay, we've learned that some of these things exist. Where do we get, this is the magic roundabout. Where do we go now? Where do we take this? Well, at very least, you've learned about 90% of the language that you need to be able to understand what plus does. Win. And we started with this premise that coding is easy. Maybe you're now thinking, actually, coding is really hard. I want you to go away thinking, coding is kind of fun, actually. It's really interesting. It's bizarre. It's weird. And as I said at the start, I want you to go away being curious about your code. Like, poke it, prod it. What does it do? Why does it do that? Read the documentation. Find out. Go and play. I don't really have time for much more. There are some kind of tools that you can use to go and poke code. You saw me using dev tools inside a browser. If you have a command line and are happy with your command line, you can do php-a. There's a tool called SciShell. This website, 3v4l.org. This is eval, if you read it in leet speak. That's a place where you can type PHP into a web browser and it will tell you what the result of running that is. If you use WP-CLI, is Pascal here? Pascal told us about WP-CLI. You can run WP-CLI shell and then you can just type stuff into WordPress, basically. Wow. Questions? Or do you want more live coding, or what should we do? Oh, also, I'm going to go down to, it's not under here, is it? Over there, what's the room called? Happiness Bar, where if you want to come and sit with me and prod and poke code until it breaks and does stupid stuff, then please do. Silence. Right, I'm off. Great, I've stunned them all. Come. Why was it 16? Yes, there were two things that I didn't show you why they happened. One was this thing here. This is 0.1, I'm not answering your question, sorry, I will do. This happens because of how decimal numbers are stored inside computers. They aren't stored accurately, and there are certain odd things that you can do that just don't give the answers you expect because it doesn't store them accurately enough. It's really hard to explain without talking about binary representations of floating point numbers, which you don't want to hear about. And why does this happen? Why is this 16? Because if you put a 0 in front of a number in PHP, then it treats it as what's called octal. You might need to go and look this up, but basically in decimal numbers you have your ones column and your tens column and your hundreds column. In octal you have a ones column and an eights column and a 64s column. So if I do 0, that forces it into octal, and then 10 this is actually a way of saying 8. This is telling the computer this is 8. So I get 8 back. So I'm giving it a number in octal, and it's coming back in decimal. So quite rightly, if I add 010 to 010, 8 plus 8 is 16. So you will very rarely use this unless you're actually 0A. Let's prod it and see. This is the kind of stuff I want you to go away and do, okay? Get curious, like Herb. Parse error. A is not a valid octal number, so you can't do it. So, can someone tell me PHP hex? Is it 0x? I can do 0xa. So hexadecimal is where you have a zeros column and a 16s column and a 16 times 16s column, whatever that is, 256. So if I do 0x, and then hex is 0 to 9, and then you have A, B, C, D, E, F, because you've got 6 more digits to represent. So that is 10. 0xf is 15, sorry. 0x10 is 16. So yeah, if you're working with assembler language, down in the guts of the computer, then you'll see this stuff happening. But if you're doing WordPress stuff, you're not going to really come across this. I kind of used this as an excuse to show you that stupid stuff can happen. But you might have a user input that someone's typing stuff into, and maybe they accidentally type in 010 or something. Generally, you're not going to pick it up. But if you're debugging why this happens, then knowing that this kind of stuff can happen is also kind of vaguely worthwhile. Go on, Herb. Do you want to just go for coffee?
Sometimes you use double quotes, which same single quotes from backtick.
Right, okay.
But it might not have been intentional.
The thing to know then is that, yes, pretty much all of my examples use double quotes like this to make strings. Remember that if you put numbers inside a string, that's also a string. So I can do get type of, let's hope this works. This is a bad idea, isn't it? String. Okay, so I get the type of quotes 42, and that's a string. You can also put strings in single quotes. Oh, bad. Right, 42. Like that, or get type. Have I been kicked out yet, Ringkeeper? No. So that also is a string. The difference here is that if I make a variable, let's call it name equals Ross, and then if I make a string with hello $name in it, then this will do what's called interpolation. Interpolation, doesn't matter. They work so hard, they're brilliant. Aren't they brilliant? Can we give these people a clap? Which means that it converts the variable into the thing that's the current value of the variable. Single quotes does not do this. So I get back, it's not doing the thing that happened before. Backticks, what do backticks do? I know backticks in JavaScript do, you can do clever stuff with syntax error. No. And that's not backticks, hang on. This is what I wanted to go and do. I'm going to get kicked out in a minute. No. Hello. Oh, is that trying to execute something? Oh, well, I'm very glad you didn't tell me to do something like that. Is that what you were trying to do? Thank you, you are wise. Okay, I'll be in the happiness part. Let's go, like, prod and poke code together. Thank you.